Why is Singapore so rich? I think it has been talked to death, right? Everybody just Singapore is rich, Singapore is rich. Yes, Singapore is rich. If I want to throw you some statistics, this is a more data-heavy video. Singapore GDP per capita, 107,000 US dollar. But what's even more important is the purchasing power parity. It means how much can your dollar stretch you. And Singapore actually ranked #1 in the world. So in terms of pure GDP per capita, Singapore is #6 in the world, lower than places like Monaco, Liechtenstein, but is ranked #1 when you take into consideration of how much we can buy with our salary, because there are certain things that are very affordable in Singapore, certain basic necessities. I'll cover some of them in my later part of this video, but because this is so complex, especially housing is so complex and how the Singapore housing is unique in the world, I'll probably do a separate video if I have enough people who comment on my comment section. So let's start. Okay, we all know that Singapore is rich, but the question is, how does it get rich? And what can we learn from it, both as an individual and as a country? Okay, most of this video is based on data that I can get from the Singapore government website, but a lot of it is also my personal analysis of how, when you combine all of these different departments and factors, how Singapore became successful. So if I have misquoted any data or misinterpreted any of the policy, I'll blame it on myself for misinterpreting it. I will try to put the source data in my descriptions. Go to the horse's mouth so that you can get your facts right. So let's set the groundwork. A lot of people know that Singapore got its independence in 1965. The only country in the world that was reluctant in getting its independence. The context was Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia in 1965. But mind you, Singapore only joined Malaya in 1963. Before that, Malaya, as it was called at that time, gained its independence in 1957 from the British government, and Singapore remained as a British colony until 1963 when it got transferred to Malaya as part of the Malay Federation. But within 2 years, Singapore got booted out. It was a very sudden divorce. You have to understand the context. At that time, even though the Chinese race was the majority in Singapore, the Malay is a big majority as well. And then you have quite a large percentage of Indian people in Singapore. Racial tension is a day-to-day affair. We are also talking about a country with no natural resources. In fact, you even need to get water from the country that just booted you out. Unemployment rate sits at 9%. Literacy rate was 70%, but it was 76.4% for male and 44.8% for female. So we're talking about a pretty low, literacy rate. Like basically you're talking about a large chunk of population that are pretty much uneducated. The differential between the literacy rate between men and women also reflects the local culture. The belief that there's no point educating women because they're going to marry a man and the man will provide for the family and so on. From an economic perspective, it doesn't make sense for half of the population to be illiterate. I'll also give you some data about infant mortality rate that will give you an idea of how dire the situation was. Infant mortality rate in 1965 in Singapore, 26.3 deaths per 1,000 children. This is on par with Uganda today. But this was already pretty good data because it was down from 75 infant mortality per 1,000 infant in 1950s. In comparison, today in Singapore, we're talking about 3 out of 1,000 infant mortality in 2024. GDP per capita. People love to quote this. So GDP per capita in Singapore in 1965 was $500 per person. This is below Venezuela and Chile and on par with Suriname. And you have to remember the context. Venezuela and Chile was resource-rich country in the 1950s and 60s, so they were very wealthy countries. At $500 per capita, it was not the poorest country in the world. So in that sense, Singapore wasn't poor. It ranked 45 out of about 180 countries at that time. So not poor, but certainly not the top 10 in the world. So when it got booted out, it was a big shock to the system. Let's look at what were the resources that Singapore had at that time. There were some good things. The main good thing certainly was the geography. It was at the mouth of Straits of Malacca, so any trade that goes between Europe to China have to go through Singapore. That's not without a liability. I mean, Singapore is surrounded by majority Muslim countries in north in Malaysia and also around the west and the south in the form of Indonesia. So that has to be balanced diplomatically. There were other good things as well. There is the Central Provision Fund, which is like a British equivalent of national pension, was established in 1955. So this was established by the British government when we were still a British colony. Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of National Development, the Housing Development Board, most importantly, Economic Development Board of Singapore was established in 1961 by the Minister of Finance, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, based on the recommendation by a Dutch economist working on a UN mission, actually. And the Dutch economist, his name is Albert Winsemeers. I must have mispronounced his name. So when the independence happened, suddenly, the politicians got to work. And they didn't sugarcoat it. Lee Kuan Yew famously said, look, the journey ahead is going to be tough. And quote unquote, everyone had to pull their weight and be counted. And no one owns us a living. So it sets the expectation that everybody is required to work hard and make this work because survival is at risk. And how did they solve the problem? And this is how I interpret what Singapore government did at that time. So you go back to the Adam Smith framework of labor, capital, and land that he set out in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So this is a Scotsman. We pretty much just learned it from the British. The EDB immediately got to work to address the high unemployment rate because when you think about it, when a large part of your population is unemployed, it often leads to a lot of social unrest. In a place like Singapore where the racial tension was already pretty high, unemployment could potentially fuel that and you have a runaway train that becomes really, really difficult to control. So EDB got to work and it was really smart about it. So what they did was they addressed the labor and capital at the same time by attracting foreign direct investment, specifically for industries in the fabric, garment, and toy manufacturing industries. Because when you think about it, these industries are capital intensive and labor intensive. And Singapore had a labor cost advantage because we were kind of poor, so our labor was cheap. And these are also the industries where you don't need a highly educated workforce. You can pretty much just get anyone who is willing to work and put them in a garment factory and voila, they start making money and start paying tax. And so that was a win-win situation for both the investor and also the local population. And you can start creating the flywheel of letting people earn more money and start contributing more to the CPF. So let's continue with EDB. So in 1967, EDB set up the Development Bank of Singapore, which is still the largest bank in Singapore today. So the role of the Development Bank of Singapore is to take care of the lending functions that EDB used to take care of and lend it to various industries such as shipyard, pig farmer, machine tool company. Again, when you look at all of these different jobs and industries, this is labor-intensive industry where the labor doesn't have to be very highly educated. But there's a financing part that you need to take care of. So DBS took care of that. And it specifically support industries that will help build the nation. In 1974, Singapore also set up a sovereign wealth fund in the form of Temasek. And DBS is then being transferred to Temasek, along with a few other industries that has already been set up by then. You know, the Kappa Shipyard, Neptune Orient Line, which is a ship building company. And all of this is parked under Temasek, and Temasek is parked under the Ministry of Finance that pretty much take care of the nation's wealth. And just to give you a context, even till today, Temasek still owns 28% of DBS, the largest bank in Singapore, 50% of CapitaLand, which is the largest real estate developer and real estate owner in Singapore, and it has shopping malls and office buildings in places like China, UK, Australia, you name it. It's a I would say world-class real estate company. Temasek also owns 50% of Singapore Airlines, SIA. And one thing to note, this is also, sometimes people don't quite understand this. So let's say you are CapitaLand and you want to buy an office building in Shanghai. You need financing, you need to borrow money. So chances are you'll be borrowing money from DBS. But the loan between DBS and CapitaLand would be arranged on a commercial term on arm's length. So whatever the prevailing interest rate it is, this would be what DBS would be lending money to CapitaLand. And CapitaLand is free to shop around with all different banks. Of course, DBS sort of have a preferential arrangement with CapitaLand. But that sort of culture builds in accountability and significantly reduce corruption, because every dollar and cents have to be accounted for and dispatched mindfully and sensibly. And so all well and good. Then what about land? My God, like Singapore manages land really well. Just to put it into context, it's the 20th smaller country in the world, but the third highest when it comes to population density. So land management is key. And land management was done initially by an organization called Urban Renewal Unit that was set up in 1964, and it is pretty much a predecessor of the current day URA, Urban Redevelopment Authority, that is parked under the Ministry of National Development. In 1971, the Urban Renewal Unit came out with what we call the first Singapore concept plan. So you might have heard that Singapore forward plan 50 years. So when we say forward plan 50 years, it means all the land, they will look at how is the land being allocated to the various users and start planning that forward 50 years. The first Singapore concept plan was conceived in 1971. And when you look at the picture, it almost looks quaint. Well, just because it was a technology back then and Singapore was reasonably undeveloped. At that time, the main focus was housing and industry. But when you look at how the timeline of how Urban Redevelopment Unit, together with Economic Development Board of Singapore, together with CPF, they basically work hand in hand to look at, okay, how can they allocate land so that people have proper housing and also the factories have enough land to produce toys and garments. As the country mature and develop, you can see that the concept plans start to integrate more things such as green space, cultural precincts, and so on and so forth, aerospace, defense, and all that. This plan is reviewed every 10 years, and it always looks ahead 50 years. I guess in a very nutshell, so in that sense, in a nutshell, Singapore became rich because there was this strategic plan, but most importantly, at an execution level, it relies on the expectation that the local people will be diligent, hardworking, and effectively follow through the concept plan and the strategic plan that was planned by a bunch of really forward-looking, visionary leaders who the local population really trusts them to want to do good for the country. And I think the trust is something really important that a lot of people and a lot of countries, when they look at Singapore, maybe it's too fluffy for them to say that the trust level is pretty high. I would say of all the countries that I've lived in, you can say that it is a result of censorship. You can say that it is a result of, people are not allowed to criticize Singapore. I would actually say that's not true. We are allowed to criticize Singapore if it's thoughtful, if it's factual, if we are open to a debate, as opposed to what I see sometimes in the UK, where it was just rage ranting. You can question things in Singapore. It's not so strict as how people portray it to be, and what can we learn from it? Well, I would say the trust between the local population and the politicians have to be high. Otherwise, it's really difficult for a government to roll out any sort of initiative. But trust is being earned as opposed to given, right? I would like to think that the Singapore government has done quite a lot to win the trust of the local population. As much as possible, communication is simplified and transparent. Simplified because you cannot expect everybody to understand the complexity of the global geopolitics and economy. Transparent because people can't operate in an information vacuum. People need information in order to buy into a certain ideal or actions. What can we learn from it? Well, getting wealthy. Look, nation building is a complex task, and a lot of nations fail, and Singapore is an exception. I think if I were to personally interpret what makes Singapore successful, is you have a bunch of people who are very hardworking. It's almost expected that you have to be hardworking. You also have a bunch of people that are, I would say, quite collaborative. We went from lots of racial tension in 1965 to getting to a point where, you know, we can sit down and have a meal and we're respectful of each other's culture. And even if we have differences, we know what are the boundaries and how to work around the boundaries. And we understand is crucial, non-negotiable for all of us to exist in this small little country. And that, it is sad to say that that is a bit of a exception in this world that we're living in. I'm very glad that at least we can still see that in most parts of Southeast Asia, where the different race coexist reasonably peacefully together. So there you go. Where is this video going? I don't know. I mean, I hope you learned something out of my view of why and how Singapore became rich from a pretty challenging backdrop when it first became a country. Anyway, if you don't find anything useful, you just treat it as a Vivian's rant. And if you find it useful, please click a like and a subscribe. And or share this with friends who are interested in Singapore, who are curious about Singapore, or who would like to visit Singapore one day and have some sort of background information. So there you go.